In the latter half of the 19th century, a series of events culminated west of the Mississippi River and would be known as the Plains Indians Wars, as European and American settlers started to arrive on the western frontier and started to create farms and establish towns, and railroads were being built. The U.S. cavalry and military would also be sent out in that way to oversee protection and stability, while at the same time Native Americans are continuing and desiring to live their nomadic ways of life. And all of this would culminate in a series of conflicts, ending with the end of the nomadic lifestyle many Midwestern tribes once knew, and being placed onto reservations, and an end of a culture coming to a close. A lot of this would come through a series of events by the Great White Father, or simply the U.S. presidents, as they were known by Native Americans, where a series of treaties had always been approved into which lands were designated for them to settle and freely roam in, but over time, those policies continued to change. The newest change within the agreements between Native Americans and the U.S. government would be a treaty at Fort Laramie in Wyoming, where several thousand Indians would arrive at Fort Laramie, and there would be an agreement that they would not interfere with Western settlers heading on the Oregon Trail and establishing farmland in the communities. For a few years, that armistice and nonviolent actions and peace was being maintained. At one point, though, a cow from one of these settlers would run loose, eventually make its way into a nearby Sioux Indian village. The cow was killed and used for food. When the cavalry arrived to try and settle the dispute, somewhere in the lines, a conflict emerged. Gunshots were fired by the U.S. cavalry and resulted in the deaths of multiple members within that tribe, and would be the unofficial spark to this Plains Indian War conflict over the next 40 years. One of the groups within the U.S. military would be African Americans following the Civil War, and they would be given the name by Native Americans as Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers is a reference to African American troops in the U.S. cavalry. Many of them are going to serve all the way into the Spanish-American War under Teddy Roosevelt, and they were given this name by Native Americans as Buffalo Soldiers because of their dark skin as well as their hair, very much being identical to the buffaloes on the plains. Incidences by Native Americans on settlers and Americans were very rare and not a continuously ongoing confrontation, but one of the worst instances in the history of Native Americans attacking on individual civilian communities would be up in Minnesota, and where over 600 settlers were going to be killed, and the U.S. military during the Civil War is going to be sent out to Minnesota under President Lincoln, and will have an investigation in which 39 Native Americans will be executed. In this tension between settlers and Native Americans and the ownership of land, the U.S. government is trying to strike deals with and agreements with Native American tribes. But it's very difficult because of cultural differences, such as the Cheyenne doesn't have one specific chief and leader who speaks for the entire nation. They have in their nation over 10 tribes, and therefore over 44 different chiefs who, as a council, make the decisions for the entire Cheyenne nation. Yet the U.S. government wants to make deals quick and simple, and they will try and make an agreement with one tribe, and yet consider that and interpret it as an agreement with all the tribes, when that is definitely not the case in the eyes of Native Americans. And so throughout this time period, you would have a series of warriors, chiefs, and leaders. Some are medicine men from a variety of Midwestern tribes, from the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Santee, and the Fox. And over the years, there had been agreements, visits with presidents at the White House toward the end of the 1800s, making these photo ops of the legacy of who they were in living at this time. Some of them, such as Chief Red Cloud, would eventually, over time, agree to another Fort Laramie Treaty to move to reservations, lands once again designated for Native Americans to be, primarily in what is today Oklahoma, at the time Indian Territory. There would be many other Native Americans who would not agree to such terms and have some unique names, such as Chief Turkey Leg, who would go and try and derail and disrupt the expansion of railroads across the Midwest plains. Other Native Americans who would also try and reinstill and protect who what there was, to their understanding of their lands and their rights, were people known as dog soldiers, warriors within the Cheyenne tribe who would use acts of violence throughout communities and destruction and burning of crops to try and show that this is their land and no one else should be infringing upon their rights. To try and capture some of these dog soldiers, the U.S. military under the Commander George Armstrong Custer is going to be sent to a place called Washita in Oklahoma in 1868 following the American Civil War. The 7th Cavalry is going to leave Fort Lawrence in Kansas, march down to Oklahoma during the winter camp settlement of Chief Black Kettle, one of those Native Americans who was actually in favor and support of resettling onto the reservations and seeking peace. Nevertheless, George Armstrong Custer and the military's information and intel tells them that there are some of these dog soldiers or Native American warriors settling amongst the civilian population at this winter camp. They are going to arrive in an early morning and attack the community, resulting in the deaths of men, women, and children in the slaughter of the teepees, the resources, the food, the wildlife that the Native American people depend upon. As a result, the Battle of Washita, or this massacre as it is now known, is within the National Park Service as a site down by a nearby river. And many of those men who would command and be involved in this conflict aren't too far distant from the original founding fathers and settlers that formed the United States that we have today. But as these battles continue to rage on, and the U.S. government's policy of forcing Native Americans to agree to these treaties and being located onto reservations and no longer committing acts of violence, it is going to culminate in a continuation of battles, and the greatest battle in this time period, the Battle of Little Bighorn, which we will pick up next time.